Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to advance on several sectors of the front line. In the Kursk region, the Russians have managed to cut off a supply road towards the Ukrainian Kursk Incursion. This leaves the Ukrainians with only a singular supply road in and out of the Kursk region, which is under constant fire by Russian artillery and FPV drones. This means the Ukrainians are now completely operationally encircled, and they are 10 kilometers between the two tips for a complete encirclement of the Ukrainian forces by the Russian forces in the Kursk region. The Russians also managed to advance further on the western bank of the Oskil river line, expanding their bridgehead across the Oskil river line north of Kupiansk. The Russians also managed to advance west of Bilorivka to the northwest of Chasiv Yar. The Russians expand the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces within the central parts of the city, as well as securing their control of the northern parts of it. The Russians also managed to advance towards Konstantinopel in the southern flank of Pokrovsk, west of Korohove. Starting out in the Kursk region, the Russians have made significant advances south of Sucha, capturing the entire forest patch here west of Kurilovka following the capture of the town. This has allowed them to cut off the secondary supply road in and out of Sucha through the Sumy-Kursk border area. This means that the Ukrainian supply route here is completely cut off. This leaves only the main border crossing highway through the border area from Sucha to Yunakivka, as well as this secondary road from Oleshnia all the way towards Sucha. This means that these two roads alongside the main highway are the only supply lines in and out of the border area. And we see that the area near Oleshnia, the road does not continue beyond the border. This means that the only supply route in and out of the Kursk region by the Ukrainian forces is through Yunakivka and onwards towards Sucha. That means if the Russians continued offensive operations alongside the Luknia river line towards Luknia and Yunakivka, they'll be able to physically cut off the final highway in and out of the Kursk region. At the same time, if they manage to hold on to their forest patch area here in the southern flank of Sucha and potentially expand it towards Oleshnia, they'll be able to physically cut off every single road in and out of the Kursk region, and it will allow the Russian forces to completely encircle the Ukrainian forces within the Kursk region. Based on this, we see that the Russians are here working on their final objective, and that is to completely capture the Kursk region by completely encircling the Ukrainian forces, and that is the current operation that they're undertaking with the flanking maneuvers here. This can limit the supply lines going in and out of the Kursk region, considering the fact that the Russians are already striking the supply route by FPV drones and artillery. And this has allowed the Russians to limit the supplies going in and out by the Ukrainians. And this has also allowed the Russians to improve their positions within the Kursk region and to deteriorate the positions of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians will now be forced to launch counterattacks to free up their flanks in the Kursk region to be able to continue supplying their forces. This can force them to redirect forces from their frontline positions. And if they do not, then they'll leave their flanks exposed, and the Russians will be able to strike them when they have been weakened by the lack of supplies, and this will allow them to cut off and create several smaller pockets of the Ukrainian forces near the frontline positions. So see, in general, the frontline positions of the Ukrainians within the Kursk region has significantly deteriorated with the developments over the past 2 days that has allowed the Russians to cut off one of the supply lines, one of the main supply lines of the Ukrainian forces, and this significantly limits the supplies of the Ukrainians in the area. Moving on to the Oskil river line, we see that the Russians have expanded north of Novomlinsk along the river line itself. The Russians have taken control over several forest lines and positions of the Ukrainians along the river line to move towards Krasnoye Pershe. The objective of the Russians is to connect the positions from the eastern bank all the way from Topoli and down south towards the Vorishna. This will significantly improve their positions on the western bank of the Oskil river line. Also, to gain control over Kamyanka near the crossing by Liman Druhi will allow the Russians to quickly gain control over this area, but they need their positions to be improved. A river crossing directly head on To storm the Ukrainian positions head on would be very difficult. Therefore, the Russians would look to expand their positions here near Topoli and attack Kamyanka from the north, and through the capture of Krasnopershe from the south to advance towards the western flank of Kamyanka, attacking it from both flanks. And with a river crossing combined with that, we'll be able to attack Kamyanka from 3 separate directions, potentially flanking it from the rear as well. So we see that the Russians are here looking to improve their positions before taking control of Kamyanka, which will allow them to connect their forces here on the western bank of the Oskil river line. The Ukrainians are pressuring them with counterattacks here south of the Varishna, and this would limit the Russian capabilities on the western bank of the Oskil river line and force them to spread out their forces both on defensive and offensive operations. Moving on to the west of Bilorivka, following the capture of the town in its entirety, the Russians are now moving westwards towards the border area between the Luhansk and Donetsk regions. The Russians, with this geolocated footage, were able to advance here west of Bilorivka. Further south in the direction of Chasiv Yar, the Russians managed to capture the northwestern parts of the city, capturing the residential area here west of the apartment complex area. With this, the Russians have further secured the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces in the central parts of the city from the western parts. We do see that the Ukrainians may or may not be able to supply their forces through the pond itself or through the forest patch area. It's not completely clear, but considering the fact that the encirclement has held on for over a month now, the Ukrainian forces may have some way of resupplying their forces, or they may have prepared for the encirclement ahead of time. But with this, the Russians have further secured the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces, and it is only a matter of time before the Russians capture the central parts of the city, unless the Ukrainians free up the encirclement. So with this, we see that the fighting over Chasiv Yar continues over the central parts, northern parts, and southern flank of the city towards Mykolaiivka. The Russians continue their offensive operations here west of Korokhove, where they've managed to gain control over the eastern parts of Konstantinopel from Ulakli, crossing over the river line, the Sukhoyeli river line, and gaining foothold within the eastern parts of the town. The fighting over Constantinople continues with very heavy fighting as the Ukrainians consistently launch counterattacks to regain some positions in the western parts of the city and free up the supply line, while the Russians are looking to gain full control of it to then move onwards towards Rosliv and Bahatir. Southwest of Rosliv, the Russians continued offensive operations to the west, where the Russians failed to storm Bahatir directly through the main road west of Rostolne. The Russians are now attacking the flanks of this road to clear up the way upwards towards Bahatir for the following offensive operations to have more success, and combined with the strike from Konstantinopel from the east, this will allow the Russians to have much more success in an attempt to gain control over the town. However, even gaining control over the town would be difficult if they do not control the northern flank, similar to the capture of Andriivka prior to the capture of Konstantinopel, or even a foothold gained within the town. So we see that the Russians will likely restart offensive operations west of Andriivka within the next few days or weeks if they are looking to attack Rosliv and Bahatir further south to gain control over the fortified positions located on the high ground above that of Bahatir and Rosliv. Gaining control over the fortified positions in the north, as well as Rosliv and Bahatir, will allow the Russians to move towards the flank of the fortified positions, the next line of defense of the Ukrainians here in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region, to launch offensive operations along the western parts towards Komar, Emirne, and the flank of the fortified positions. We see that the Russians have managed to regain the momentum lost by the Ukrainian counterattacks that have happened over the past few weeks. However, this is not the end-all be-all. We saw yesterday the Ukrainians managed to regain a lot of positions through a lot of fighting. According to some reports, many of these were already destroyed, as we saw with follow-up geolocated footage, which indicates that the Russians are looking to regain these positions and kick out the Ukrainians following their counterattacks. We see heavy fighting taking place here in the southern section of the front line, and the situation is very dynamic. But as it seems right now, the Ukrainians are still in a very critical position in many sections of the front line, as in the western bank of the Oskil river line, in the Kursk region in its entirety, in the direction of Donetsk, Chasiv Yar, and Pokrovsk, and in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region. These are all areas that are very critical for the Ukrainians right now, as they are all on the verge of a decisive battle where the Russians can significantly improve their positions if they succeed with their current battles, and this will allow them to overcome the Ukrainian defensive lines that they are currently getting stuck at. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.